In this video, we're essentially going to create a complete clone of Reddit's comment system where you can create comments, edit and delete your own comments, like different comments, and most importantly, you can reply to comments in an infinitely nested system, which is way harder than it looks. This project is a great intermediate to advanced level project that includes database work, backend APIs, and a front-end React project, so it includes everything you need and is a great project for your resume. Welcome back to Web Dev Simplified. My name's Kyle, and my job is to simplify the web for you so you can start building your dream project sooner. And today we're going to be building out this comment system that you can see on the right-hand side of my screen, and it's a very involved project. As you can see, I'm currently logged in as the Kyle user, so I can edit and reply or delete my own comments. As you can see, I can edit and I can delete this comment if I want, but I can't change the comments by Sally, for example. And I could just come in here and say, new reply. Click post and you can see that reply shows up. I can like different things, I can unlike them. It's very similar to how Reddit's comment system works in like that threaded nature, minus a few of the extra features of Reddit, because we were really focusing mostly on liking, replying, editing, deleting, and nesting to different comments. So this is going to be a very involved project, but it's going to look just like this when we're done. Also, one other thing I do want to mention about this project is if we go into this client folder over here on the left-hand side, I just have a boilerplate React application set up. I've deleted almost all the files. The only thing I added in is this styles.css. I'm not going to be covering the CSS in this tutorial. It's mostly pretty straightforward. I mean, these styles are not anything really that special. So if you want to follow along exactly, just go to the GitHub link in the description down below, and that's going to have this CSS file that you can find. It's inside the source folder here called styles.css. Just use that CSS file, plop it in, import it right here in your index.js, and that's going to work just fine. You're going to get all the styles that I'm using in this video. I just don't want to cover them because it's really not pertinent to the actual important information in this video. Now, with all that out of the way, let's actually get started with this project. And the very first place that I want to start is going to be on the actual server. I want to set up my database for how I'm going to structure my comments, my likes, and so on. What we're going to do is we're going to go over to our server and we just cd into that folder by saying cd server. And I want to run npm init-y. And that's just going to initialize a package.json file for us, just like this. And now we need to download the dependencies we're going to use in this project. So I can say npm i --save dev, because these are dev dependencies, and I want to install Prisma and nodemon. Prisma is what we're going to be using for our database, and nodemon just allows us to automatically refresh our server every time changes are made. Now, if you're unfamiliar with Prisma, I have a full crash course on it I just released. It's going to be linked in the cards and description for you to check out. Now we can see we have those installed, so I can create a script here called dev start, and that's just going to run nodemon server.js. Whoops, just like that. So if I create a file called server.js, whenever I run that dev start script, it's just going to run all the code in our server.js file. Now, the next thing we need to do is actually start working with Prisma. So we need to install the Prisma client so we can use it. So we'll say npm i, and we want to install the @prisma/client. And that's going to allow us to actually use the Prisma code we generate. And now with that installed, all we need to do is actually set up Prisma so we can start working in Prisma. So to do that, we can just run npx prisma init, and that's going to initialize a Prisma project for us. And if you can see over here, we now have this Prisma folder as well as this .env file. So this Prisma folder, we can just expand this here so we can really see what we're working with. This Prisma folder here, we have our schema. This is where all of our information for our models of our database are going to go. And then our env is going to have our URL for our server. So in our case, it's going to be a Postgres URL, and we're just going to change these values. So for my particular database URL, we're going to have this say Postgres here. And the password is just going to be password. And this is running on localhost port 5433. And the database here, I want to call comments, just like that. So this is going to be my own personal URL to a local database running on my computer. You need to already have your database running before you put in the URL here, otherwise it's not going to work. So make sure that you create a database with this particular URL before you put it into your project. Now with that done, we can move over into that Prisma schema file. And if you don't already have the extension for Prisma installed in VS Code, you're going to see a bunch of weird formatting. So just make sure you install this Prisma extension so you get the correct formatting. And with that said, now we can set up all of our different models. So we're going to have a model for a post, because if we go over to this application, you can see we have like a post 1 and we have a post 2, and we can see all the information for that post stuff. So we need to be able to have a model for post, and we need to have a model for the comments that are going to be in those posts. So we're going to have a model for our post, which is going to have an ID. I'm going to be using a string for my IDs, and that's because I'm going to be using a UUID. So our default is going to be a UUID, just like that. Next, I'm going to have a title for our post, which is going to be a string, and we're going to have our body of our post, which is also going to be a string. Pretty straightforward, as you can see. We have a title up here, and we have the body down below it. Now, before we set up our relations for like comments that are inside of our post, I want to set up just all the rest of our default models. So we're going to need a model for our user because obviously users are going to be the people that are making comments. So our users are also going to have an ID, which I'm just going to copy over the information. They're going to have a name, which is going to be a string, and that's all the information we care about when it comes to a user. Now we can focus on our comment model, and this one's going to be much more complex because this is where all the complexity of our application lies. So first inside of here, we're going to have an ID, and I'm just going to again copy that ID information down. And we're also going to have a message. That's essentially what your comment is. That's going to be a string. And I also want to put in here a created at and an updated at date. So we could say updated at, and those are both going to be date times. And one interesting thing is by default, I want this date for created at to be now. So by default, when I create a comment, the created at date is going to be set to the current time. And this updated at, I essentially want to be set every time we change our model. So we can use at updated at, and that's going to automatically update this timestamp every time we make changes to our comment. So that's setting up all that information for us. And now we can actually focus on the more complex parts, which is hooking up all of our different relations between comments, users, and post. And we'll get to likes after that. So our comment is going to have a user that made the comment. So we know we're going to have a user, which is going to have this user type. And if I just click save immediately, it's going to automatically populate a bunch of code for us. As you can see, it added the comment to our user. We can change this to say comments, just to make it a little bit nicer to work with. So each user has multiple comments that they have written. And on our comment, it has a user, which is relating to that by the user ID, which it automatically generated down here. We can do the exact same thing with post. So we can say each comment is also going to have a post. Just like this, click a save here, and you can see it auto-populates all that information for us. And up here, we can just change this to say comments, because each post has multiple comments. Now, in order to get the actual nesting portion of our comments to work, we also need comments to have an optional parent ID. So we can come in here and say that we're going to have a parent, and our parent is going to be a comment. But this is optional, because obviously a root comment, such as this comment right here, doesn't have a parent, because it's just a child of the post. It doesn't have a child or a parent comment above it. So we're going to write that in like this. If we click save, it's going to somewhat pre-populate our information, but it's not going to be perfect. So first of all, right here, this should say parent ID instead of comment, just so the name lines up with our actual row right here. And this should say children instead of comments because these are the child comments. Now, the next thing you'll notice, if we just put the parent ID into here again, is we're getting an underline here saying there's an error. And the reason there's an error here is because we have two references to this comment table inside of the same table. So we need to give them names so we know what they are referencing. So we can say here, inside of a relation, this is going to be the parent-child relationship. That's the name we're going to give it. And for this comment, it's going to be the exact same relationship. We can say parent-child. So now we've essentially linked these two things together. We're saying, hey, this parent ID right here is pointing to this array of children inside of this comment. And again, if this is something you're confused by, make sure you check out my full Prisma crash course. It'll be linked in the cards and description for you. This is covering all the information about Prisma in there, so that this should be relatively easy to follow. Now, one other thing I want to do real quick is I want to make it so that any time that we delete, for example, a user, it automatically deletes all the user's comments as well. So we can come in here with an on delete, and we can just say we want this to cascade. And what that's saying is anytime that we delete the thing that this points to, which is our user, delete all the comments that that user had as well. Same thing here, if we delete the post, obviously if there's no more post, all the comments for that post no longer matter, so delete all of those comments. And same thing here, if we delete the parent comment, delete all of the children comment inside of that because obviously they have no parent anymore. Now the last model I want to cover is going to be for our likes. So we can just come in here, we can create a model for a like, and a like is really simple. It's just going to be a user and a comment because a user is going to leave a like on a comment. So these are the only two things we care about. So we have our user and we're going to have our comment. And if we give it a save, it's going to automatically pre-populate all of that information for us. Now you will notice we're getting a bunch of errors with this model though, and that's because we don't have an ID. We could come in here and we could, create an ID, but instead of creating an ID, I'm going to create a joint ID because we know that a user ID and a comment ID are always unique because a user can only like a comment one time. There can never be more than one like that has the same user ID and the same comment ID. So we can say that the ID is just going to be a combination of our user ID and our comment ID, and that's going to make it so that it's guaranteed that you can never leave two likes on the same comment if you're the same user. And we also can make sure that we do that on delete cascade for both of these. Because again, if we delete our user or we delete our comment, get rid of all of those likes, they no longer make sense. Now with that done, we can click save, and that's all of the model information for our database done. Creating the actual database model itself is fairly simple because there's only 4 different models and they all are pretty basic models. The hard part is going to be when we start implementing all of the logic around these models. So now that we have this done, what we can do is we can run npx prisma migrate dev. And what that's going to do is it's going to create a migration on our database that essentially changes our database to look just like this, as you can see here. And it's going to ask us to type in a name for this. So we can just type in a name of a init, for example, because we're initializing our database with all of this information. And now our Postgres database that's on our computer running has tables for a comment, it has tables for a like, and it has tables for users and so on. So we have all of that information built into our database. I guess one thing I do want to change is I want to change this to say likes instead of like. So I'm going to run another migration because I made changes to my schema. I need to create a new migration. So I'm just going to type in that migrate dev again. It's going to run, and now it's just going to make minor changes to have this say likes instead of the capital like it was before. And I think that's going to look a little better. Also, I guess I'm going to do the same thing here with this likes. So I'm just going to run that migrate again one more time just so that those names are consistent across our entire application. And you will notice when I do this migration, it's not actually making me rename my file to a different name. And the reason for that is because changing this doesn't actually change our database itself. It just changes the code that interacts with our database, our JavaScript code. So we don't need to create a new file that runs on our database. That's why it's not asking me for a new file name. So now with all of that done, now we can actually go in and start working on our server. Before we start writing our server code though, there's one other database related thing I want to do, and that is seeding our database. You can actually make it so your database starts with data inside of it by seeding it, and to do that in Prisma is really easy. We can just create a file called seed.js, and in this seed.js file, we can put all of our code for seeding our database. So in our case, all that I've done inside of here is I've just deleted all of our existing data for posts and users. I've created 2 users named Kyle, Sally. I've created 2 posts, which just have a boilerplate post 1 and post 2 title and some random lorem ipsum text. And then I've created 3 different comments. This is a root comment, and this is a root comment, and then this comment right here is nested inside of one of our root comments, and all of these comments are on post 1. So we have 2 posts and 3 comments and 2 users that we're creating automatically whenever we run this file. Now to hook this up with Prisma so we can automatically run this file, in our package JSON, we need to add essentially one section. So we can come in here and we can add a section called Prisma. And inside this Prisma section, we need to add a seed. And all this seed is just going to be a command that we can run. So that command is just node prisma/seed.js. So we're just saying, hey, whenever we seed our database, run this command right here. And this command is just pointing towards that file we just created. So now I can run npx prisma db seed, and what that's going to do is run that Prisma seed file we just created because we linked it up right here. We are getting an error though. The reason for that error is we're using the normal import-export syntax that's from ES modules, and by default, Node doesn't support that. You need to tell Node in your package JSON by specifying the type that your type here is going to be module. We're just saying, hey, we're using ES6 modules. That's what we're doing. So now if we rerun this command, hopefully this should work just fine, no problems. And as you can see, it says the seed command has been executed. So now all of this information for creating this default data, it's been added into our database. So now at least we have data to play around with in our database. Now, in order to run our server, we need to download certain libraries. So we can type in npm I here, and this is going to be for installing our libraries. And we're going to be using Fastify as our server of choice. It's very similar to Express, but when it comes to creating APIs, Fastify just makes it a little bit easier, which is why I prefer it. So we're going to install Fastify. We're also going to install something called .env, which will allow us to pull in environment variables into our project. And then we're going to install essentially a bunch of different plugins to Fastify. So we're going to install @fastify/cookie. That's for dealing with cookies, so we can have user authentication. We're going to do @fastify/cores. This is going to allow us to communicate between our client and our server. And if you're unfamiliar with cores, I have a full video covering exactly what it is. I'll link in the cards and description for you. Also, we're going to have @fastify/sensible. And this just makes it really easy for us to send errors down to our user. So now we can just hit enter, and that's going to install all those different libraries. And what we can do in our server.js is actually get started on our project. So in here is where we're going to set up our Fastify application, which if you're familiar with Express is going to look almost identical. So to get started, we can just come in here and we can say we want to import Fastify from Fastify just like this. And then what we can do is we can create an app variable by running that Fastify function. This is identical to Express up to this point. Now to listen, we can say app.listen, and we just need to pass it an object, and this object has a port, And this port here, for example, could be like 3000. And now it's going to run on port 3000. Now, I don't want this port to be hard-coded. Instead, I want it to come from an environment variable. So we can say process.env.port. And if we just come up here and we make sure we import .env from .env, and we run that .env.config, this is going to load in everything from our .env file. So if we come in here and we put a port, for example, we just say port 3001, now when we run our server, it's going to be running on port 3001. And we can test that by saying npm run dev start, which is that command we created in our package JSON that runs our server. And as you can see here, we're running a server that's on port 3001. So now what we need to do is just to create a basic get route that's going to return a list of all of our different posts. So to do that, we first need to import the Prisma client that we're going to be using. So this is coming from @Prisma/client, and we're getting the Prisma client. And then we can get an instance of Prisma, which is just a new Prisma client, just like that. Now with our app, we can say app.get, again, just like Express. And inside of here, we're going to have our path, which is just going to be our root path. Actually, we're going to call this /post because we're getting all of our post. We're going to have a request and a response. And inside of here, we can use that Prisma client to actually try to access our data. So I'm going to make this asynchronous because Prisma is asynchronous. And we can await prisma.post.findMany. And you'll notice that I'm not actually getting any autocomplete for this. So one thing that you can do to fix your autocomplete, hit Control-Shift-P and search for TypeScript. You'll see this TypeScript restart TS server. If you run this, it's going to restart your TypeScript server, which is hopefully going to fix your autocomplete for Prisma. Now you can see I'm getting my autocomplete, so I can say find many, and in here, that's going to get all of the different things. So if I pass it nothing for the where clause here, it's going to get all of the different things. And we can pass in a select to tell it exactly what columns we want to get. For example, we only care about the ID, so I'm going to say true, get me the ID, and I only care about the title, so I'll say true. The reason for that, if I go back here, is I only list out the title, and then when I click on it, it's going to use the ID to bring me to that exact post over on this side of my screen. I can just expand that out a little bit so it's easier to see. You can see here we're just listing out title, and that's it, and the link from this goes to the ID. Super straightforward. So that's why we're only returning that information. And instead of having to do like a response.send and all that complicated stuff, with this, we can just say return. And it's just going to return the data for us as JSON. So now if we try to go to that URL, which is localhost 3001/post, hit enter, you can see it returns to me that JSON data. So as you can see, we're at localhost 3001/post, and I have an ID for my first post, which is titled post 1, and an ID for my second post titled post 2. Super straightforward. Now, one thing that's really important when you're dealing with creating an API is actually handling errors. Right now, if this throws an error, we're not actually handling that at all. And it's just going to give us some complicated, jumbled up error mess that we can't actually process. So I'm going to create a helper function for us. We're going to call this commit to DB, which is just going to take in a promise. And this helper function is going to determine if there's an error in like our Prisma related code, it's going to make sure to handle that error and properly send it down to the user without just like vomiting on our server and doing something weird. And this is going to be an async function because we are going to be doing asynchronous code. And inside of Fastify, there's a really handy function called, app.to. And this to function is actually a part of that sensible library that we installed. So right now we're not using that sensible library, so we need to import that. So we can come up here, we can say import. That's going to become from Fastify/sensible, just like that. And the library itself is called sensible. Then to use this, we can just come down here and say app.register, and we can register that sensible library. So now we're using that sensible library, and if I come down to here, you can see we now have autocomplete for that to method. And all this to method does is it takes in a promise, some type of asynchronous code, which in our case, this is asynchronous code, and it's going to return to us an error, and it's going to return to us a result. So if we have an error, it gives us an error. If we have a result, it gives us a result. So we're just going to await that, and we're going to say we have our error and our data. So if we have an error, I want to do something. Otherwise, if we don't have an error, I'm just going to return our data down to the user. So if we have an error, instead I want to return app.http errors, which is something that came in that sensible library, and I want to return an internal server error. An internal server error is a 500 error. It essentially means that there's something wrong on the server. All the user information was correct, but our server did something wrong. Like if our database throws an error, it means there's something wrong and we're not really sure what it is. And inside of here, I just want to return the message for our error. So what this is going to do is throw a 500 error from our server, send it down to the user, and it's going to give them the message for that error. So it's really helpful for our user. Then what we can do is we can take this commit to DB, and we're just going to wrap our promise in this. So we can just do this. And now our promise is wrapped inside of that. So what's happening is when we call this function, we're passing down this Prisma code. This Prisma code is running inside of here. If it has an error, it's going to give that error down to the user. Otherwise, it's going to take the data and return that just like normal. So if we refresh over here, and I just expand my page so you can see it, we're still getting the same exact data being returned. But if we had some type of error, like let's just say we put some bad code in here, and now we refresh this, you're going to see, hey, status code 500. That's what I was talking about. That's like that internal server error. Let me just move my camera a little bit. You can see it says error is an internal server error, and the message is saying ASDF is not defined. So it's giving us the message, the status code, and the error. It's all really useful stuff. And that's why I really like using that Sensible library inside of Fastify. Let's just bring this back to how we had it before. I'm just going to change that back to true so we have all of our information working as it was before, and we're getting the correct responses showing up on the right-hand side of our screen. Now I could go ahead and start adding in more methods on our server, but instead what I would like to do is to start working on the client so at least we have something to look at, because right now just looking at this is really ugly and I'd like to actually have some UI to look at. So we're going to go over to our client. So I'm going to create a brand new terminal tab. I'm just going to CD into that client folder. So we're actually inside the client folder into here. And I want to install one single library, and this library is called Axios. Axios, it just makes using the fetch API in the browser so much easier, which is why we're going to install that library. Now inside of our client folder, what we can do is we can open up this source folder and we can run our application. So we can say npm start, and that's going to start up our application. So if we just give it a quick second here, and we're going to wait, and it's going to pop up on the right-hand side of our screen. So just a second here, there we go. So now it's loading up. And right now, the only thing I have in our app is just the text hello world. So once this is done running, it should just say the text hello world on the right-hand side of our screen. There we go. Super straightforward stuff. Now, the thing that I want to do next is to start hooking up our application to take the data down from our server. And there's a lot of different ways I could do this, but what I want to do is I want to make it as reusable and flexible as possible so we can really easily expand our application. I'm going to create a couple folders here. I'm going to create a folder called services, and this services folder is going to be all the code that deals with calling out to our API. That way, all of our API calls are happening in one single folder. So I can create a new file in here. I can call this, for example, posts.js, and now all of our requests for our server that go to a post, such as getting a list of posts or getting an individual post, are going to be in this one single file. I'm also going to make another file in here. This one's going to be called makeRequest.js. And this is going to be the helper function that does all of the requests for us. And all of our other files are going to be really straightforward. So inside of here, we're going to export a function called makeRequest. This is going to take in a URL as well as some options. And this is just going to directly call Axios for us. So we can return calling Axios by saying Axios, and we just pass it in our URL and our options. And then we can just have a really simple .then and a .catch. So our .then is just going to take in our response, and it's going to return our data. So we can say res.data. Our .catch is going to be a little bit more complicated, but not too bad. We're going to have an error, and it's going to take that error. And for now, we're just going to save so we can see this a little bit better formatted. What I want to do is I want to return a new promise, which is a rejection. So we're going to reject a promise that is just going to go into our error. So we can say error.response.data.message. And sometimes this error is not going to be populated like we expect, because this is what it's going to look like from our server. But if we have an error on our client, it's going to be slightly different. So we just want to make sure, hey, if we have an error property, then do all of this stuff. Otherwise, if we don't, just render out the text error, just like this. So it's either going to get a custom message or it's just going to have the text error. And that's going to be what this function does. So all this make request function does is it takes our normal Axios request and it breaks it down into two things. If it's successful, it returns the data. If it's an error, it returns us a message. So it just makes it a little bit easier to use this promise, since the exact result is going to be our data or our error. This just cleans up that code, because we otherwise would have to do this everywhere in our application. Also, we need to import Axios so we can use it. So I'll say import Axios from Axios. And one other thing I want to do is create a variable called API. The reason I'm creating this variable is because every single request in our application is going to go to localhost 3001/something. We have the same base URL for every single request we make. So we can use axios.create to set some default parameters. For example, we know that our base URL is exactly the same. This is going to come from our .env file. It's going to be called React app server URL. And it's really important if you're using environment variables in React, they all must start with React underscore app underscore whatever the name is. Otherwise it won't work. So now we can create a .env file just like this. Make sure I move it into the correct folder. There we go. And inside of here, I could say React app server URL, and that's localhost 3001. Make sure I put the HTTP at the front, and that is our URL right there. So now every time we make a request, it's going to use this base URL as long as I use API here instead of Axios. Also, I'm going to pass with credentials as true, and that's because we're going to be using cookies in order to store our user information. And if you don't have this set, the cookies don't actually go with your request. So this is just going to make it when we start implementing user information, this is going to make it so it sends everything correctly. It's going to give the cookie to the server, which is what we want. So now that we have this function written, we can actually use it to create our function for getting our post. So we can say get posts, just like that. And this is going to be a function. And all this is going to do is return make request, and we're going to pass in /post. So it's just making a request to that /post URL inside of our server. And the nice thing about this is that's how dead simple this function is. I mean, it does not get much easier than this. And that's because we did all the boilerplate code right here, which means we don't have to copy it anywhere else. So now we can create a file, and we're going to put it inside of a folder called components. And it's just going to be called postlist.js. So here I want to export a function called postList. And inside this postList function, for now, we can just return the text that says h1 postList. And in our app, we can render out this postList. PostList. There we go. So now if we refresh our page over here, you can see it says postList instead of hello world, which means we're rendering out this component. Now what we can do is we can use a simple use effect, just like this. Make sure I import this at the top of our page from React. There we go. And inside this use effect, I want this to only run the very first time our server starts up. And I want to make a request to that post. So we want to get our post just like this. And this is going to return to us some data. So we can say .then set posts. So we're going to have some state post set post equals use state, just like that. And by default, I want this to be an empty array. And in here, json.stringify posts. So let's just give it a save real quick and see what happens. You can see it starts out as an empty array, and then nothing happens. We probably have an error. Let me inspect and see if we do. Bring this over, look at our console, and you can see, of course, we have an error. Failed to load, the server responded with a status 404, uncaught promise. So essentially, we're having a 404 error being thrown. It's saying it cannot find that URL. Let's see exactly what URL it's trying to access. We can go to the network tab to do that. And what I want to do is I just want to do a refresh on our page, expand this a little bit so we can see. And you can see, eventually, after a little bit of waiting, we're getting a response and it just says cannot get /post. So there's something going on that is incorrect. The thing that is incorrect is we created this env variable file right here, but we never restarted our server after we created it. You need to restart your React application every time you make changes in this file, otherwise they won't persist. So now when we restart this, give it a second, it's going to refresh our page, and we should see that we're going to get a list of our posts being printed out. And of course, it looks like we're still not getting that list printed out. So if we just inspect our page, let's take a look at what this error is. If we go to our console, it's saying, hey, access to this is not allowed. We're having a CORS error. We need to make sure we implement CORS. This is luckily very easy to do because we're using that CORS library. So if we go into our server, what we want to do is we want to import that CORS library. We'll just call it CORS, and it's coming from fastify/CORS, just like that. And we can say we want to register that CORS library. Register this CORS library, and we want to give it some options as well. These options are going to be the origin. So what URL are we making our request from? This is going to come from an environment variable. We're going to call this our client URL. And then we also say that our credentials here is true because we're sending along cookies. This again just ties in with that with credentials from Axios. So this origin is the link to our URL for our client. So we can just come into our env file. We can say client URL. We know that this is localhost 3000. That's what by default React runs on. So now with that fixed, hopefully when we make a change or when we refresh our page, it should work, but it looks like it's still not working. Let's see exactly what the error is. So we can inspect our page, go over to our console, and we're getting the exact same error. We're still having those CORS errors. This is again a matter of having to restart your server when your .env file changes. So we're just going to restart this server real quick to get those new file changes implemented. And now hopefully if we refresh our page, it should work, and it does. As you can see, if we expand this over, we're getting essentially all of the data from our server. We have the IDs and we have the titles for our different posts being returned onto our server. So now we can actually print those out onto our screen. So let's go back to that post list component, and instead of returning an H1 here, instead what I want to do is I want to loop through my post. So we're going to say post.map. For each post, we want to return something. And what we're returning here is just going to be a really simple object. We're going to return an H1, and this H1 has a key, which is our post.id, just so we have a unique identifier for it. And then inside of our H1, make sure we close that off, we're just going to put a simple anchor tag. So we're just going to come in here, we're going to say anchor tag, href is going to be pointing to our post URL. And our post URL is going to be /post/ and we want to get our post.id. And that's going to link us to that post page. And then we can just close this off and we can put our post.title inside of here. Now, if I just give that a quick save, refresh, you can now see we have two links, one going to post 1 and one going to post 2. Pretty straightforward. Now, obviously, when you're working with React, most often you're going to be doing React Router instead of anchor tags like this. So let's actually implement React Router into our application instead of using these anchor tags. So let's just make sure we close out here and install React Router DOM. And I'm also going to install a library called React Icons while I'm at it, because we're going to need that later. That React Icons library just gives us these, trash can and edit icons really easily. That's all that is going to do. So with that done, let's get our server restarted by calling npm start. Now we can swap these out for link tags inside of React Router. So to work with React Router, if you're unfamiliar with it, I have a full crash course. I'll link in the cards and description for you that covers it. But for this application, it's going to be very, very straightforward. Inside of our index here, we need to get our browser router. So we're going to import from React Router DOM. We're going to import that browser router, and we're just going to wrap our application in that. So we're going to say that our application goes inside this browser router. Then inside of our app, we're going to return our routes for our application. We only really are going to have 2 routes. So we're going to say here, we're going to get our routes, which comes from that React Router library, and we're going to have 2 different routes. The first route we're going to have is our home route, which is just @/, and this element that we're going to be rendering for that is going to be our post list, just like that. We're also going to have another route. This one is going to be @/post ID, just like this, and this is going to render out a post component. We don't have that yet, so for now, I'm just going to render out null. So it's going to render out nothing. So this is all that our routes are. And I need to make sure I import that route component there. There we go. So now we have a route that leads to essentially this, and a route that leads to nothing. I can even just come in here and say h1 post. So now if I change in our post list these anchor tags to links from React Router, which we can do quite easily, and I change this href to a 2 here, now when I click on these links, it's going to bring me to that page, and you can see for now it's just printing out the text post, which is what I put right here. No matter what this is, that's what it's going to be printing out. For now, we can just go back though to this page right here. Also, one thing I want to do is I want to wrap everything in our application inside of this container. So we're just going to give this a class of container, drop this down like this. And it's just going to give us some nice spacing so it's not all cramped on the edge of our screen. So now at this point in our application, we have the most basic communication between our server, our database, and our client. I do want to clean up our code a little bit though, because if we look inside of our post list here, first of all, it's kind of cumbersome to always have to write out our use effect like this. Secondly, we're not taking into account loading states or error states, so I'd like to fix all of that by just creating a simple custom hook that's going to create all of this logic for us. So we're going to create a new folder. This folder is just going to be called hooks, and inside of here, I'm going to create a useAsync.js custom hook. And this is just going to take any code that runs asynchronously, for example, this get post, and it's going to return to us the data, a loading state, as well as an error if there is an error. Really straightforward. And I'm actually going to implement it in 2 different ways. The first way I'm going to implement it is where it's going to automatically run in a use effect for you anytime anything changes, which is good for instances like this post list. But I'm also going to create a second instance that allows you just to run it whenever you want. So for example, if you create a comment in this page, like you type in here a comment and you click post, that is going to run an asynchronous request, and we want to be able to fire that off whenever we want. So I'm going to have 2 versions, one that's automatic and one that allows you to fire it off on your own time. So inside useAsync, let's export both of those functions. The first function is going to be called useAsync, and this is going to take in a function, and it's going to take in some dependencies. just like that, which by default is an empty array. And then I'm going to copy this, I'm going to paste it down, and we're going to create a useAsync fn version. And this fn version has the exact same dependencies, but it's just going to return to us a function instead of automatically running the code for us. Now, to make both of these different functions work, we're going to need a third function, and this is going to be called useAsync internal. And this function doesn't get used anywhere else but inside of this file. And this takes in a function, it takes in some dependencies, and we're also going to take in an initial loading variable, which we're going to set to false. This initial loading variable right here, all that this does is determine if our loading state starts out as true or starts out as false. Really pretty straightforward. So we can create our different state. We're going to have a loading state, and that's going to be equal to use state, and by default, it's going to be set to our initial loading value. So it's either going to be false or true, depending on which one of these function versions we use. Then I'm just going to copy this down a couple times, because instead of loading, we're going to have our error. And our error by default is going to be nothing, so we can clear that out. And then here, we're going to have our value. Just like that. So we have our loading, our error, and our value that we're currently taking care of. Now we're going to have a function called execute. And this function is going to be using useCallback, and it's going to take in some random parameters, just like this. So in order to understand exactly what's going on inside of here, what we're doing is we're creating our different state that we care about. Like we want to know, is this loading? Is there an error? What is the value of our result? And this callback right here that's getting this function called execute, this is just the function that we call in order to set all of these different values. So this execute is going to call whatever function we pass into useAsync. So if we go to our post list, the way we would use this here is something like this. We would have this say const, and we would get our data. So for example, we'd say like loading error value, and we would just say equals useAsync, just like this, and we would pass it in that get posts function and our dependencies, which is just an empty array. So we can just leave that off if we want to, because by default, we set it to an empty array. Now we've cleaned up all of our code. We have our loading, our error, and our value. We can even set this to post, for example, just like that. Whoops, flop that around. There we go. So now we have our three different properties that we care about, and this is just going to automatically run this code for us inside this useAsync. So this execute right here that I'm talking about is the thing that's going to be automatically run for us. So let's write our execute code. First, when we call the execute function, we want to set our loading to true because we are currently starting to run this application. Then I want to return the results of our function. So our function is going to take in all of the different parameters. So the way that this execute function is going to work is it's going to work exactly the same as our normal function. We're just adding in additional functionality to set all of these different values for us automatically. So this func right here would be like our get post. That function right here, get post. We're calling get post with all of the parameters we care about. In our case, there are no parameters. We're just calling it as is. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say, hey, you know what? When we get our result back, we're going to be getting our data. So what we can do is we can say set value to our data. We can set our error to undefined because we no longer have any error if we got to this point. And we can return our data. So if we want to chain on to the end of this, we can do so with our data. We can also get a .catch inside of here, which is going to be almost identical. So I'm just going to copy this code down here. And instead of setting our value, we're going to set our error. So we're going to say our value is set to undefined and our error is set to error. Also, I want to make sure here I do a promise.reject, and I want to reject that error, just so we, again, are making sure if there's an error, we rethrow that error to be used at a later time. Finally, we're going to add in a finally, and all this is going to do is say set loading to false, because now we are no longer loading our data because we have finished the loading process and we've set our value or our error. Lastly, since this is a use callback and we have some dependencies that we care about, what I want to do is I just want to say, you know what, when we get our dependencies, I want to make sure that we only ever refresh our execute function every time our dependencies change. Obviously, in this example, we don't have any dependencies because we just want to get all the posts and then that's it. But if we had like an ID, for example, for a post, we would want to refresh our post every time that ID changed. So that's what we have. And now we just need to return our pertinent values. So we're going to return loading, error, value, and execute. So we're returning those three values we care about as well as the ability to execute this function. So if we come up into here, our useAsync func is going to be really straightforward because all we're going to do is return the results of calling useAsync internal. We're going to pass it our function and our dependencies, and it's going to be false for our initial loading because by default, this is the function version that we can call whenever we want, so it's obviously not going to run immediately, so loading is going to be false. This version up here is going to be slightly different though. Here we want to get out that execute function as well as all of the other state that is inside of our function. That's the things like loading, error, value, and so on. And it's going to come from that useAsync internal, pass it in our func, our dependencies, and here we want to set our initial loading state to true because we're going to be using a useEffect to immediately invoke this function. So we're going to be running that execute function immediately, which is really the key right here. We're immediately executing this function. And here we're just going to put in our execute function as our dependency. So every time our dependencies change, our execute function is going to get updated. And this useEffect, every time our execute function gets updated, reruns itself. And by default, we're setting loading to true because immediately we're running this function. Then all we need to do is return all of our different state information, and this useAsync is exactly the same as useAsync function, except for we no longer have the execute function, we took that out, and we're immediately invoking it automatically and re-invoking it every time our dependencies change. So with all of these changes, if we go back to our application and we just do a quick refresh, it looks like I spelled func wrong somewhere. It looks like right here. There we go. Let's try saving now. You can see that we no longer have those errors, but we're probably getting an issue somewhere else. Just back to our page here, come over to our console, cannot read properties of undefined, reading map, and the reason for that, if we go back to our post list, is we're currently in the loading state, because by default, post starts out as nothing. So we need to just have a check in here to see if we're loading. We also need to check to see if we're in an error state. So if we're loading, let's just return a simple h1 that says loading, just like that. And if we have an error, let's just return a simple h1, give it a class name of error message. That's just going to give us some red text, and we'll print out our error message inside of there. So now when we're loading, it's going to say the text loading. So if I refresh this, we should see a very quick blip of it saying loading, and I can actually slow down my network speed. Come over here. I can change my speed to slow 3G just like this. So now if I do a refresh, you can see it's going to be much slower, but as soon as the page loads, it's going to say the text loading on the screen, and that text for loading is going to stay there for a while before eventually the actual data shows up. Now this is obviously very, very slow to load because I'm on a very slow 3G connection, but you saw that that text loading popped up for a while before the actual data showed up. Now I'm going to just get rid of all that throttling and close that out for now. So if we do, a refresh, it's very quick again, which is exactly what we want. Okay, now with all of that done, we've just essentially made it way easier for us to create future components that need to do things asynchronously because we have a single hook, one line of code, way easier than what we had before. Now we have everything for our post list completely done, so we can actually move on to what's going to happen when we render an individual post. And the first place we need to start is going to be on our server. Let's go back to that server.js file. I'm just going to expand this a little bit so we have more space to work with. I'm going to create another app.get. I'll just copy this one down, I guess, for now. And we can say that this is going to be for getting an individual post. So we want to get a post with this individual ID. Again, if you're familiar with Express, this should look very similar to you. And what we want to do is instead of doing a find many, we want to find unique. And we're going to be finding a unique one where our ID is the ID that is passed in from our request.params.id, just like that. There we go. So now this is going to find us an individual post, but we want to select only specific fields for our post. So I'm going to come in here with a simple select, and the select is going to contain all the information that we care about for our individual post. So what I can do is I can say that we want to select the body of our post. So we're going to say true. We also want to select the title of our post, so we can say true, and that's just the information for our post so we can render that out. Also, we want to get all of the comments for our post as well, and we want to order them. So we're going to say order by. We want to order them by the created at field, and we want to do that in descending order. This is going to make sure that all of the new comments show up on the top and the old comments show up on the bottom. Also, we only want to select certain fields for our comment as well. The fields that we're going to care about is the ID, so that we can make sure that we can edit and delete comments with a given ID. We also want the message, obviously, so we can show what the comment is. We want the parent ID, so that we can show what the actual parent of that comment is, so we can get our nesting correctly. We want the created at date so we can render that to the user. And we want information about the user that posted the comment. So let's select some user information. I want to get the ID of the user as well as the name of the user. And this is just going to make sure I can determine if the actual user is myself by checking the ID and then showing the name on the comment itself. So we're getting a bunch of information about the comments right here, as well as some minor information about the post. Now, if I give this a quick save, we now have a brand new URL that we can access that's going to give us all the information for one particular post. And that's all we care about. So let's just minimize this so it's a little bit easier to read everything. Might as well minimize that too. We can go back to our client now since our server portion is done. And inside of here, we can go to our particular component, which we're just going to call post.js, export function post, just like that. And this should say post. There we go. Now what we could do inside of this post component is we could do all of our code for handling our posts and our comments and our nesting and so on. But since that's going to be spread everywhere throughout our application, for example, we have our post information, we have comments, we have nesting, like we have multiple components deep that we're going to have information stored. Instead, I'm going to create a single context that's going to store all that information for us. We're going to create a brand new folder called contexts. And inside that context folder, I want to create a post context.js file. And this is going to contain all the information for our post, as well as the comments on that post, and allow us to add comments, delete comments, edit comments, nest comments, whatever we want to do. So inside of our app, what we want to do, instead of just rendering out this H1 here, we want to render out that post context that we're going to be creating. We're going to be calling it a post provider. There we go. And inside of this post provider, we want to render out our individual post, just like that. So let's save that real quick. We can save this post here real quick. And of course, we're going to be getting errors because none of these different things are defined yet. Inside of our post, let's export a function called post provider, which is that function that we just needed right here. That's the component we're using here. So now we can import post provider, and we can import that post component. So that should hopefully at least clean up those errors for us. And if we just output something here like the text hi, you can see it's going to print the text hi to our screen when this runs. And it's not going to do it right away. And that's because in our post provider, we need to make sure we export the children we pass to it. So inside of here, we need to create a context. So let's do that. Context is equal to react.createContext, just like that. And we can say we want to return our context.provider. It's going to have a certain value, which we're just going to default to an empty array for now. There we go. And inside of here, we're going to render out our children. So now if I save, hopefully it's going to work if I make sure to import React at the top of my application. Now we have the text hi showing up. So what I've done so far is I've created a context. And if you're unfamiliar with the context in React, I have a full video covering it. I'll link in the cards to the description for you. But essentially it's a way to share state between many different components. And I'm wrapping my post component, which is the child, in this provider. So now my post and all of the children of my post can access everything inside of this context. Right now, though, the value of our context is nothing. We're not storing anything. So obviously, the first thing I want to do is I want to store my post information inside this context. Obviously, that makes a lot of sense. So we want to use the hook for getting our post. So if we go to our services here, we currently have a service for getting all of our posts. Let's create a service for getting an individual post. And this is going to take in an ID, and we're just going to pass that ID along right here. There we go. So now we have a function for getting an individual post using our services folder. Again, it's super clean. Now in our post context, what we can do is we can actually try to call that function using the useAsync hook we've created. So we can say useAsync, and we want to essentially call a function that's going to get our post. So we can say get post, we want to just get one post. And this is going to take in an ID. And this ID is going to be a dependency for this function as well. So what we've done right here is we've essentially said, okay, we're going to be taking in this function, and this function gets a post with a given ID. And every time our ID changes, update this function right here. Pretty straightforward stuff that's going on. Now, what else that I want to do is I want to be able to get that ID. And the ID comes from React Router. You can see it's right here inside of our URL. So we need to use the params hook that's built into React Router. We can just say const ID is equal to use params, and that's going to give us the ID of our post. So now we can come in here and we can say that we're going to have information such as loading, error, and we're going to have our value, which is a post, just like that. That's going to give us all of our information, and we could just say console.log post, and we can see what this looks like. If I inspect our page, bring this over real quick, and you can see we now have an object, and it has that body. It has all of our different comments, which there are 3 of, and it has the title post 1. We also have a bunch of errors, and I'm not sure if those errors are because of previous information. Yeah, it looks like those are just previous errors from when we were making changes. So as you can see, this works just like we want. It has all of the information for our post, and by default, it starts out undefined because we are doing loading. So I want to make sure we take into account our loading and our error. So to do that, inside of here, what I want to do is I want to just check if we are loading, And then what I want to do is I want to render out an H1 that just says loading. Whoops, loading, just like that. We can kind of clean this up a little bit. So there we go. If we're loading, render that out. Otherwise, what I want to do is I want to do a nested ternary, which is generally not the best idea, but it's going to be fine for this simple use case. So if we have an error, then I want to render out an H1 that has that class of error message. And this is just going to be our error. And then finally, if we're not loading and we don't have an error, then render out the children just like this. And I can clean this up a little bit, get rid of that. There we go. So first, if we're loading, render out the text loading. If there's an error, render out the text error message. Otherwise, render out our children. And now you should see if we refresh, we get a really little flash of the text loading before it jumps over to our actual content, which is high. And that's exactly what we want. So now we actually have that information. And inside of our value here, we want to send our post along. So we're going to have a post, and this post is just going to take all of the content from our post as well as our ID. So what this is doing is it's creating an object that has a key called post, and this post key has an ID as well as all of our post information. And we're just adding this ID in because in our server, we never sent the ID along. When we did our select here, you can see we never selected the ID because we don't need it because our post already has access to that information. So we're just making sure that's accessible everywhere. So now that we have the basics of this done, let's go ahead and try to use this post somewhere else. So we need to create a function to use this. So we'll create a function called usePost. And this is just going to return use context of our context. That's straightforward, all we need right there. So now in our post, we can just say that our post is equal to use post, just like that. And that's going to be coming straight from our context. And now we can actually render out some HTML for this. So I'm going to use some fragments here for our HTML. I'm going to create a big H1 that is going to be for our post.title. So we can just save and see what that looks like. And you can see we get the title right there. I can also come in here with our article tag, and I can say our post.body. And now if I save, we get all of the text for our post showing up as well. The next section that we're going to have is going to be an H3, and this H3 is just going to say comments. I'm going to give it a class name here of comments title, just to give it some extra styling. As you can see, that's showing up down there, which is great. And then we have a section, and this section is going to contain all of our comment related information. But currently, all we have is this post.comments array, and this array is sorted, but it's not nested like we want it to be, because if you look over here, we have nested comments, just like this, all of this different nesting. But our post comments is just a flat array with no nesting, so we need to fix that issue. So what we need to do is go back into this post context, and at the top here where we're defining all of our different information, we need to define another piece of information, which is going to be our comments by parent ID. So I want to group each of our comments into its own separate array based on whatever the parent is. That way we only have to loop through the array once, and it's going to be a lot more performant that way. And we're going to also use memo on this again to help with performance, because we only want to create this array every single time we actually change our post to a different post, or change our comments, for example. So what we can do is we can say we want this to change anytime our post.comments changes. So we can say we have our group, which is just going to be equal to an empty object. And at the bottom here, we're going to return our group. And in the middle, we're going to populate that group by looping through our post.comments. So we can say .for each comment. What I want to do inside of here is I want to take our group of comment.parentID, and I want to set that equal to an empty array. Otherwise, just use whatever it is. So what this does right here is it's saying if the group does not already have a group for this parent ID, create an empty array for it. Otherwise, don't do anything at all. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that exact same array that we just created, or the array that already exists. I'm going to add in a new comment to it. So we're saying, okay, whatever the parent of this comment is, create a tag for that ID, create an empty array for it, and add this comment to it. Otherwise, if there's already an array there, just add the comment to it. If we just console.log this, it's a little bit easier to see what's going on. So we'll log that value out. I'm going to inspect our page over here. It looks like we're probably getting an error. It just says cannot read properties undefined, reading comments. This is because when we're loading, our comments is obviously empty. So we can just say if post.comments equals null, then return just an empty array for now. That'll just be a placeholder fix. Let me make sure that's looking like it's still, oh, right here, we need to do the same thing, just like that. There we go. Okay. So now what we can do is we can expand this array, and you can see that we have two values. The first value here is null, which is meaning that there is no parent ID at all. And if we open this up, parent ID null, parent ID null. So where the parent ID is the same, you can see that that's what the key is. This one has a key, which is a really long ID. And if we look at the parent ID, this parent ID is the exact same as this ID up here. And if we had multiple comments with the same parent ID, they would all show up inside this section. So now we essentially have a brand new object where the key is the parent ID and the values are all of the different comments inside of that parent. So it allows us to really easily create that nested structure that I was talking about. So with this structure, what we can do is we can create a simple function called getReplies, which is going to take in a parent ID. And all that's going to do is take our comments by parent ID, and it's going to get all the comments for that particular ID. Now we can return that function, getReplies, as well as we can return all of our root comments. And the root comments is just our comments by parent ID where that ID is null, as we already saw. So now we essentially have a way to get all the replies of a particular comment, as well as a way to get all of the different root comments, which is what we care about for rendering out our post. So inside of our post here, we can actually render out our root comments. So we can say root comments just like this, and now we can render out those root comments. So if root comments is not equal to null, and root comments.length is greater than 0, what we want to do is then render out just a really simple list. So we'll give it a div with some margin on the top just to give us some spacing. And we can render out a comment list and pass it in our root comments. Just like that. So this is a comment list is just a component we're going to create. As you can see, we're getting an error because it doesn't exist. So let's create comment list.js. Comment list. And this comment list, like I said, takes in a list of comments. Pretty straightforward. Now, if we import that into our post, it should hopefully get rid of that error for us, just like that. Obviously, it's not rendering anything though, because this component does nothing. So let's do this component. This is actually a really straightforward component in our application because we're just rendering out each one of our individual comments. So we could say comments.map, and I want to map over each comment. And for each one of the comments, what we're going to do, whoops, let me fix this up. There we go. We're just going to take a div. We're going to give it a key, which is our comment.id. And inside of here, we're just going to render out a comment. And I'm also just going to add some basic styling. So we'll say class name is equal to comment stack, because this is a stack of individual comments. And inside of here, our comment is just going to take all of the properties of a comment. Let's create that component for now. Comment.js, export, function, comment, taking in a bunch of information like an ID, it's going to have a message and so on. And for now, we're just going to return the message and we're going to put it inside of a div. There we go, just like that. So inside of here, let's make sure we import that comment component. There we go. And let's save. And you can see down here, it says, I am another root comment. I am a root comment. So it's rendering out both of our comments. Obviously, there's no styling or anything fancy, but it's at least rendering them out and it's starting to look like an actual application. We don't have the comment nesting done yet because all we're doing is rendering out the root comments. Inside this comment component, that's where we're going to take care of the nesting. So what I want to do is I essentially want to create all the styles for our comment, and then we can go about adding in some of the functionality just so we have something a little bit nicer to look at than this really ugly application. So we're going to have our ID, we're going to have our message, we're going to have our user information, we're going to have our created at, and that's really all we're going to have for now coming from our comment. And what we want to do inside of this section is render out all the information for our comment. So let's do that real quick. We're going to come in here, we're going to be using fragments because we're going to have multiple things being rendered. And the first thing we're going to render is our comment. So let's give it a class name of comment. And inside of here, we want to have a div that has a class name of header, because this is going to be the header section. And if we look over here, we can see what our comment is going to look like. So inside of our header, we're going to have two spans. One is going to be for the name of the user. So this is going to be user.name, just like that. And then we're going to have another one, and this is going to be our date. And to render out our date, we're actually going to create something called a date formatter. And we're going to format a date, which is going to be date.parse, our created at time, just like that. And for our date formatter, we can just say date formatter is equal to new intl.datetime formatter. And this is going to take in undefined as our locale, so it'll automatically change the locale for the specific user. So if you're in the US or you're in Spain, it's going to render the date exactly how it looks for you. Our date style here is going to be medium. whoops, medium is a string, and our time style is going to be short. And that's just going to give us the style that we want, so it looks just like this. If I go back over here, you can now see that it prints out the name as well as the date over here. If we change time style to long, for example, you can see we're going to get extra information about the time. Or if we change this date to short, you can see it shortens down the date. I think medium and short looks pretty good for our comment-based system. Now let's go back over here to see what we need to do. Next, we're going to have this message section. This section is very straightforward. Just going to give it a div that has the class of message. And we're going to put our message inside of there. Come back over here. You can now see the message for our comments is being printed out. Finally, we have our footer with all of our different buttons. So div class name footer. Now inside this footer, we have a bunch of different icons, as you can see on the right-hand side here. And each one of these icons works almost exactly the same. When we click on it, you can see it has this active state that it's going to swap between. As you can see, it's working with both the edit and reply. So we need to be able to handle whether or not it's active, as well as make all of our basic styles. And since all of these are going to be essentially the exact same button styling, I'm going to create a single component to handle these buttons. So we can create a component here called icon button.js, and we'll just export function icon button just like this. Now inside this icon button, we're going to take in an icon component. We're going to take in an isActive flag. We're going to take in a color, as well as any children that are going to go inside of this button. Then what we can do is we can return ourselves a button. And inside this button, we're just going to want to put in our icon as well as any children if there are children. So we're going to have a span here, and this span is going to contain our icon. And this icon is a component that we're going to pass in. That's why we're giving it this component syntax. So right there we have our icon, and the span around this should have a class name here. And this class name is just going to be a really quick check to see if we have children. So if children is not equal to null, then what we need to do is we need to give it a class of mr1. Otherwise, we're not going to give it any class at all. And this is just going to give us some space. As you can see, this heart symbol right here has a number next to it. That is a child for a button. So we need to space out our icon and our button from one another. That's all that this little class right here does. We can also render out the children right here. And now that's the basics of our button. All we have left is to actually finish off our button. Also, another thing about our button is we have one other prop inside of here, which is just all the additional props we would pass to our button. So what we can do for our button is we can specify the class name. Our class name here is going to be really simple. It's going to have a button class. It's going to have a icon button class. And then finally, depending on if it's active or not, it's going to have another class. So it's going to either have an icon button active class or no class at all. That's all that this class name right here is doing. And then we're going to add in one final prop here, which is going to be, whoops, our props. We're just going to spread out all of our different props. Also, we want to be able to determine what color our button is going to be. So we're just going to pass in that color prop as well, just like this. And we're going to default it to an empty string. And the reason for this is because our trash can, you can see, has this red color. So we're passing in the red color while all these others have the default color, just like that. So now let's take a look at what it would look like to actually use this. So we can come in here, we can say we want to get an icon button. And this icon button, we know is going to have a couple different props. It's also going to have a light count for, like, let's just say 2 is our light count by default on this. So we're going to have an icon, and this icon, we're going to say that it's going to be coming from Font Awesome. So we're going to say FA, and this is going to be our heart icon. And we can just import that up here. FA heart from React icons / Font Awesome, because we're using the Font Awesome icons. Now if we come over here, you can see we now have that heart icon showing up, and it's the filled in heart icon. There's 2 different types of heart icons. We'll swap between them when we get the implementation details done. Also, we're going to have an aria label here, and this label is just going to say like. And we're going to change this label later when we start implementing things like liking and unliking, but for now, it'll just say like. Pretty straightforward. Now we have our like button done. Let's come in here and get 4 more buttons, because if we look over here, we have a button for reply, edit, and delete. So for our reply button right here, we're going to do FA replying, or just FA reply, sorry, there we go. And this is going to say reply, and it doesn't have any children, so we can just self-close this, and none of these actually have children, so we'll just self-close all of them. There we go. So now if we save, you can now see we have the reply button. We're getting closer, that's really good. Next up, after the reply button, we're going to have our edit button, so we can say FA edit, give it a save, Look over here, now we have the edit icon showing up, and this one is going to be FA trash, just like that, and this should say edit and delete. Now if we look over here, you can see all of our icons look great. Obviously we just need our color on this trash can icon to be set to danger, and that's going to give us that red color. There we go, perfect. And the reason that this danger color gives us this color is because I have a CSS style for this. Again, you should have installed the CSS styles if you wanted to follow on exactly with this tutorial. Now with that done, we actually have the majority of our comments done, but we need to be able to render out the child comments as well as the root comments, because right now we're only rendering the root comments and none of the child comments. To do that, we're going to do that outside of our actual comment itself. But before we can do that, we actually need to get the child comments. So we can use that get replies function as well as our post here from use post. And we actually, I don't even think need the post. We just need the get replies. And what we can do is we can say child comment equals get replies, and we can pass in the ID of our current comment. So we're passing in the ID of our current comment, which is going to be the parent ID for all of these child comments that we're getting the replies for. So now down here, we can say child comments, and we can just check the length. We want to check it just like this. If the length is greater than 0, then what I want to do is I want to run this code to print out all of our child comments. And the child comments are a little bit more complex because we're going to have this, bar on the left-hand side, which actually we can click to expand and collapse just like you can do inside of Reddit. And this bar right here is going to have extra spacing. So there's just a lot of stuff that's going to go into rendering these child comments. To get started, the first thing I want to do is I want to render this inside of a fragment. And inside this fragment, we're going to have a div, which is going to be for rendering out essentially our comment as well as the sidebar stuff. So this div is going to have a class name here. And this class name, is going to contain our nested comments stack. And then it's also going to contain a check here to see if our children are hidden. So by default, I'm just going to say are children hidden equals false. This is going to be something we're going to dynamically set up in just a bit. But for now, we can just say are children hidden. If they are hidden, then we want to give this a class of hide. Otherwise, no class at all. So by default, we're setting this to false, so our children are shown, but if we click this sidebar, we want to hide them, and that's what this little bit of code right here for our children hidden is doing. And inside of here, what we want to do is we want to render out a button. And this may seem really counterintuitive because our button is literally a vertical line, but this just makes it so that when we are starting to hit tab to go through our application, we can actually tab onto this, and I can use spacebar to actually expand and collapse this different row, which is really important for keyboard accessibility. So now inside of our button, we should give it a label. So this label here is going to be hide replies. And I also want to give it a class name because obviously by default, it's going to look terrible. So our class name is going to be collapse line, just like that. And we don't even need to give it any text. We can just make this self-closing. There we go. So now if I come over to here, you can see it doesn't really look like anything's changed, which is perfectly fine because we really haven't done anything other than add a line, but we haven't added the comments themselves. So now let's add the comments. We're going to say that's going to be in a div called nested comments. We want to render out that comment list component we used before, and our comments are just our child comments, just like this. So now if I save, you can see perfectly already our child comment is showing up. Now when I click this button, it doesn't do anything yet, but that's perfectly okay. We are now getting our child comment showing up, and if this comment had another child comment, it would show up, and so on and so on and so on, all the way until there's no more children comments. Now outside of this div, I want to create a button. And this button is going to be for expanding our comments. If we look over here and we hide our children, we have this button for showing the replies. So we need to be able to actually have this interaction show up. So we want a button. We're going to give it some fancy class name related stuff. So we can say it's going to be a button. It's going to have some margin on the top as well. And then we're going to say, hey, you know what? If the children are not hidden, then we want to add the hide class. Otherwise, do nothing. And then finally, we can set up an on-click in here to make it so that we set our children, hidden to be false, because now we're expanding them to show them, and this should say show replies, just like that. And then we can take our collapse line, which we have right here, we can add an on click to this as well, and this is just going to say that the hidden is set to true. So we can change this constant variable here to a state variable. Our children hidden, use state, by default we'll set it to false. And now, hopefully, if we come over here, we should have no errors, but it looks like we do have an error. Yep, let's see what that error is. Console, too many re-renders, so let's see why that is. So obviously our error is these onClicks should be functions like this instead of immediately calling the function. That was my issue here. So now we save, and there we go, that's working. So now we can click this, and we can click it again to show and hide these different comments. So that section's working good, and pretty much all of our rendering of the content is working fine. Now we just have to hook up our server to do things like liking, replying, editing, deleting, creating comments, and so on. So the very first thing I want to work on, which is probably going to be the easiest, is just the ability to create a comment on a post. So if we go back to our post here, you can see that currently we're just listing our comments, but we don't have a way to create a comment. I want to be able to have something like a comment form. And this comment form is going to be this form that you can see over here, which is just a text box with a post button. Super straightforward. So I want to be able to have this comment form. So to do that, I'm going to create a brand new component called commentForm.js. Export function comment form, just like that. And then in our post, I'll make sure to import that just so we don't have any errors. So hopefully everything over here is still working just fine. It's just rendering out nothing, which is perfectly okay. Now, first, let's focus on our rendering. We can just say we want to return here a form. And inside this form, we're going to have a div. This div is going to have a class name, which is comment form row. This is just going to make sure we style the row, which in our row, we have a text area. Whoops. Text area, and this text area we just close off, just going to be like that. And we're also going to have a button, and this button is going to say post inside of it. If we save, you can see we have that section. Now obviously we should give it some classes. This is our message input, and our button here has a class name of button. That's just going to make the styles a little bit better. Already it looks pretty good. You can see we have those styles going on. I also want to include a section here that's going to go after all this, which is going to be a class name of error message. And we're going to put an error inside of there. For now, I'll just put the text error, and you can see kind of what that looks like. So now we have our error message text showing up as well, which is really good. Also, we're going to be getting in loading information. So inside of here, we're going to be getting information like loading and error. And we're going to print out, for example, error inside of here. And in loading, we want to be able to disable our button when things are loading. So disabled is going to be equal to loading. So if we're loading, we're going to disable our button. Pretty straightforward. Also, I want to change the text inside of our button. So if we are loading, the text should say loading. Otherwise, it should say post, just like this. There we go. So now if our button is loading, so if we come over to our post and we just say loading, now our button is disabled and it's got this right here. Obviously, we don't have any styles for our disabled state. That's a little bit of an oversight on my part. But I could just come in here, let's just add those in, and you'll be able to, when you download the file, these will be there for you. So we can just say all the way at the bottom, dot button, disabled, and where did I get my styling here? Let me copy this real quick, there we go. Color here, we're just going to change this to be like 20%. There we go. So now it looks like a gray button. So this will be there automatically for you. You won't have to add it yourself, but I just forgot to add that when I was creating this code. So there we go. We now have that done. Back to our comment form. We can get rid of that loading state because we don't need that anymore. And into our comment form. One other thing we should do is we should set the type of our button to submit. So we know this is a submit button. And also in our text area, we should probably set up our value as well as our on change here. So we can say that our value is going to be our message, which we can create a simple state for at the top here. Set message equals use state, and it's just an empty string by default. And on change, what we want to do is we just want to set that state value. So we could say e set message e.target.value. There we go. And of course, we need to make sure we import use state. So now, as I change this, it's updating this message variable right here. Also, our form should probably have an on submit. So we could say on submit is equal to handle submit. Let's create a function called handle submit and make sure we prevent the default of that function. Now, before we go about writing this function, one other thing I want to do is on our text area, I want to set an autofocus property. And this autofocus property is something built into React, which is really handy. So whenever you refresh your page, if something has autofocus, it'll focus it. But more importantly, if a component gets added to your page, it'll also get focused. So over here, if I click reply, my focus is automatically in the reply box. Or if I hit edit, my focus automatically gets moved into this edit box. So that's a really important key, is that we're going to be moving our focus around. So I want to be able to configure this autofocus property what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pass that in like this. And by default, I'm going to set it to false. So by default, this box, when I refresh, will not be focused because it's set to false. But if in my post, I set autofocus to true here, now when I refresh my page, it automatically focuses that. And if I add a new one to the page by clicking like reply or edit, it'll automatically focus that for me. So that's a really important property to have, and it's really useful because doing that otherwise without that property is a little bit of a pain. So now back into our comment form, we want to handle this submit function. This handle submit function is going to take in a function, which is called onSubmit, that we're going to pass into our comment form. And it's going to say onSubmit, and we're just going to pass it in our message dot then. If this is successful, then we're going to set our message to an empty string. So pretty straightforward. If we successfully changed our comment or submitted it, then clear out this form because obviously we want to be able to rewrite a brand new comment from scratch. Also, we're going to have an initial value, which we're going to set to an empty string. I'm just going to move this to the end here. There we go. So we have an initial value, and we're going to use that initial value for our message. And that's because if we click the edit button over here, you can see the initial value is our actual value for our comment. So we want to be able to make sure we can set that value. And this right here is pretty much everything for handling our comment form. You'll notice a lot of the logic doesn't actually fit inside this form. We're just passing that logic off to somewhere else. And that's because all of that logic is going to land in these services. We're going to have services for creating comments, removing comments, editing comments, and so on. And that's where all that logic is going to go. So if we go back into our post, we're going to need to be able to pass in information into here. We need to pass in information for loading. We need to pass in information for our error. And we also need to pass in information, for our onSubmit. So we need to pass in those three different properties. For now, it's going to give us an error probably if we try to do anything, but these are the different properties we need to be able to pass into here. And to get that information, it looks a lot like our useAsync function. It has a loading, it has an error. All we need to do is just handle the onSubmit. So let's go into our services. I'm going to create a brand new file, and this is going to be for our comments. We're going to export a function called create comment, and this is going to take in some properties. We want a post ID, we want a message, and a parent ID. So we're going to be creating a comment on a particular post with a particular message under a particular parent ID. And we can return calling that make request, and we're going to be making it at the post URL. So that's where our post ID comes in, /comment. And we're going to create this on our server in just a second. We also need to pass it in some data. So our method here is going to be post because we're making a new comment. So that is a post request. And our data here is just going to be our message and our parent ID, just like that. So we're passing along our parent ID and our message to our server to create this comment. Then instead of our post, we can use that fancy useAsync hook that I've been talking about. So we can just come in here and we can say we want to get our loading, our error, and our value from useAsync. And this time we want to get the function version and not the non-function version. The reason for that is I only want to call this create comments function when my comment form submits on submit here. So I can pass in that create comment function that I just created like this. Now I have a brand new function. Right now it's called value, but it's a brand new function that can create a comment for us anytime we call it, and it's going to properly set this loading and error based on the actual return values of our create comment. So let's call this value here create comment function, just like that, so it's a little bit easier to read. And then I'm going to create another function called onComment create, and this is going to take in our message. And this is going to be what we pass as our onSubmit. So whenever we submit our form for creating a comment, it calls this function. And inside this function, we're going to call create comment function. And this create comment function takes in a post ID, which we know is just post.id. It takes in a parent ID, but we know our parent ID is null, so we can just leave that off because it doesn't have a parent ID. And it's going to take in a message, which we already have right here. So that's all the information we need to create a comment. And when we say .then, this is going to return to us our actual comment. So we can just say like console.log comment. This is going to be the return value from our server. And this loading and error, we just pass down to our load comment. So we can say loading error, just like that. And now we have our comment form done, and it's calling this onCreate right here. So now if I just type this in and click post, you're going to see that it's posting out a comment. And this is on our old version. That's why this is working. If we go over to our new version and I create a comment, it's not going to work because we haven't done the server side. You can see when I click post, nothing is actually happening. It's not really doing what we expect. The reason for this is that this value property is actually the return of create comment. It would be like the same as this comment right here. I don't care about the value. I care about the execute. The execute is the actual function itself. That should hopefully fix this error. So now when we type this in, hit post, you're going to see it's working, but we're getting an error. It's saying, hey, this route does not exist, which makes sense because we haven't created that route on our server yet. So the next step is to create that app.post route that goes to /post/id/comments. That is the route right here that we're trying to access. So now we can actually access that with our request and our response. Now, the very first thing I want to do right here is do some validation. I want to check to make sure we passed a message because obviously you can't create a comment that's blank. So if our request.body.message is equal to an empty string or our request.body.message is equal to null, well, then we have an error. Obviously, they sent us back some bad information. So I'm going to say res.send, and I want to send our app.http errors.bad request, and we can just say message is required. So now what's going to happen is if we don't pass up a message, we're going to get this error. So we can test that. Let's just refresh our page, and we can click post, and you can see, okay, it's saying our post is not correct. Something with our URL looks like it's incorrect. Let's just make sure we have this right. Post ID comments. That looks correct. Let's make sure that it's correct inside of our service as well. We have posts. There we go. This should be an S. Okay, now with that done, refresh our page just to make sure everything's good. Click post, and you can see it says message is required because we never passed it a message. So our error checking right here is working fine. With that out of the way, we can do our return of our commit to DB, and we can pass it in our prisma.comment.create because we want to create a brand new comment. We want to pass it in some data. This data is our message, which comes from our body. We're going to have our user ID, which we're going to figure out how to do in a little bit. So for now, I'll just leave that as null. We're going to have our parent ID, which comes from our request.body.parent ID. And our post ID is our request.params.id, because that's inside of our URL parameter right here. So for handling our user ID, we're going to get that from the cookies. So we can say here request.cookies.userid. But right now, we're not actually storing any user ID in the cookies at all. So how exactly we're going to go about doing that? We could create a brand new login system to log in users and all of that, but that's a lot of work and it's not at all related to this content. So instead, we're essentially just going to fake it. What I'm going to do, scroll all the way to the very top here. I'm going to app.register cookie. And this cookie is going to come from Fastify cookies. So we could say, cookie from Fastify/cookie, just like that. So that's the cookie library. We're going to pass it some properties here. We're going to pass it a secret, which is just going to be our process.env.cookie secret. That's for signing cookies if we have to worry about that. So now we have essentially a cookie library right here. Now what we can do after this is we can actually set up a hook. So we can just say app.add hook. And this hook is going to be on request. So whenever we make a request, it's going to call this hook, which is a request, which has a request, a response, and a done. If you're used to middleware in Express, this is essentially middleware in Fastify. What I want to do is I want to say, hey, if our request.cookies.userid is not equal to this variable called current user ID, which I'm just going to create in a second here. We'll just say const current user ID equals 1 for now. We'll figure it out in a little bit how to actually do that. So if our user ID for our cookies is not equal to our current user ID, well, I want to remedy that. I want to fix that. So we can say request.cookies.userid is equal to our current user ID. So first, I'm just going to automatically set our cookies to that current user ID so we can use it in all of our requests. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to send down our response to clear out our user ID cookie in the browser. And then I'm going to say also set this user ID to the current ID. So user ID is our current user ID. And then when that's done, we just call done, just like that. So what this is doing is it's just allowing us to actually fake that we are logged in. Because normally when you're logged in as a user, you have some information being sent down in a cookie that represents your user. This is just going to send down the user ID in a cookie. And we're just going to have this current user ID variable that we use to do that. Now to get this, all we're going to do is we're just going to call await on user.find first. We want to get where the name is, for example, Kyle, and then we're going to get the ID property of that. So let's just make sure we fix our parentheses here. There we go. So what we're doing is we're just getting the first user with the name Kyle, getting their ID, and we're setting that as our current user. So this line right here is faking whatever we're logged in. So we're currently logged in as Kyle. That's what this is saying. If I change this to Sally, now we're currently logged in as Sally. And this hook right here, all it does is every time we make a request, it's going to set the cookie on our browser to the user ID of this current user. So that way we have the same information on our server and our browser. Now to get the user, normally you would have a hook to do this. So we could just say like use user.js, export function use user. And this use user hook needs to return our user ID, which comes from our cookie. Now I'm just using a regular expression to do this. I'll actually just copy this over. You can get this from the GitHub repo if you really want. It's just a regular expression that pulls out the user ID from our cookie, and that's it. It's kind of annoying to write, which is why I'm not writing it out by hand, because it's just an annoying regular expression. But if you want to know how this regular expression works, make sure you check out my full regular expression guide. I'll link it in the comments and description for you. But with that done, we now have access to our user ID on the client and on the server. If I just actually refresh or inspect my page here, I go over to the application tab, you can see already in our cookies we have our user ID. I'll clear this out and I'll refresh our page, and you'll see that it sets our user ID every single time. And you can see that this user ID has a value that starts with 841. Now if we change our user to Sally on our server, just like this, and I come back over here, refresh my page, you'll see that we now have a different value. It's C6D66. So all that this code does is it just allows us to fake that we're logged in as a user. And it's nice because we can just change this one line right here to say that you're logged in as either Kyle or as Sally. So it's really easy to fake being logged in as someone. And this is really useful because now down here, we can use that user ID right here. And it's working just like if you were logged in, because you would get that user ID from the cookie. So with all that said, that's a long-winded way of saying now we have the user ID. Now also, I only want to select certain fields, and these fields are going to be the exact same fields we selected up here for our comment. You can see we have our ID, message, parent ID, all of this different stuff. So I'm going to take these fields right here, this entire object, I'm going to put it inside of a new object. We're just going to call it const comment select fields is equal to this. Then down here, I can just select those fields. Here I can select those fields, and now we have the same fields for both creating a comment and for getting all of our users right here. Let's just make sure we get rid of that extra comma right there. There we go. That fixes that up. And that should be all we need to do to create a comment. So now what I can do is I can type something in here, click post, and it created that comment for us. And if we inspect our page, it should be logged out to the console. And as you can see here, we logged out that comment that I just created to the console and has all the information I care about. And as you can see, it created the comment as Kyle. If I change who I'm logged in as by coming up here to be logged in as Sally, refresh our page, so now we're Sally, and I create a new comment, post it, you'll see when I inspect this comment, the actual user here is Sally. So depending on who we're logged in as, we can determine that right here with this one line of code, super useful. So now this is great so far. We're creating the comments, and when we refresh our page, those comments show up, but they don't show up when I click post. We want them to show up immediately because I don't have to refresh the page to see the comment I just created. That's kind of clunky. Doing this though is unfortunately a bit more complicated than it first looks. So if we go to our post here, what we're doing is we're creating our comment, and when we're done creating it, we have access to the comment right here. What we want to do is we want to store this comment locally somewhere so we can render it out to our page. But we already have our comments being stored inside of our post. So what we need to do is find a way to store our comments locally and get the comments from our post and combine them together. So the best way to do that is going to be in this post context. Currently, we're just using our post.comments. Instead, I'm going to create a local array of all of our comments. So I can say const comments set comments is a new use state that is just going to be an empty array by default. And then what I can do here is just a simple use effect. And this use effect is going to happen every time our post.comments changes. And we can just set our comments to our post.comments. And I only want to do this if our post.comments is not equal to null. So if it's equal to null, just return. So what this little bit of code does is says, as soon as we load our post, take all the comments from our post and set them into this comments variable. Then everywhere I was using post.comments, I want to just replace it with normal comments. So we can just clean this up a little bit. Everywhere that was post.comments should be comments. So if I search for post.comments, it's only being used in this one single place. And now we have a local array of comments that we can use. We can add information to this array, and everything is going to work fine, but now we have a local version instead. So if I save, Over here, everything is exactly the same as it was before, but now we have this local array where I can change it by adding things to our state. For example, I could create a simple function that's called like create comment, but I'm going to call it create local comment instead, because we're going to be creating a comment locally. This create local comment is going to take in a comment, and all I'm going to do is just going to set comments. I'm going to take in my previous comments, whoops, and I want to return my previous comments and my comment added to the top of that array. So now I have a brand new function. We'll export this down here. And what I can do inside of my post is I can import that, create comment function, and right here in our .then, I can just call create local comment. So now I'm creating this comment every time that I actually call this create comment function. So I create it on the server sends it back to me, and when it sends it back, I now create it locally as well. So let's see if that works. FFFFF, hit post. You can now see we got a brand new comment that was created. Same thing, create another one, boom, right there, brand new comment that's created. So now by hooking this up with a local array, we're now storing all of our information locally, and we're getting it from the server, creating that local array, and then we're modifying that local array anytime we make changes inside of our client. So now that we have the entire workflow for creating a comment done, let's focus on replying to comments, because replying to comments is just a fancy way of creating a comment, so it shouldn't be too tricky for us. So the first thing that we need to know is we have this reply button right here. So we want to be able to toggle whether or not we are currently replying. So we're going to use a state for that. We can just say is replying, and we could do set is replying. And by default, we are not replying, so this is going to be set to false. So our button here is going to toggle that on click, and we're going to just say set is replying to true. Actually, we want to set it to the previous value. So we're going to say prev, and it's just going to be the opposite of our previous value, just like that. So it's just going to be flipping between the two different values. So if I change my is active here to be equal to, whoops, is replying, now what we can see is when I click the reply button, you can see that this is toggling between the two active states, which is exactly what we want. Also, I want to change this label right here. So by default, it says reply, but if we are currently replying, I want it to say cancel. And let's make sure it says cancel reply, so it's a little bit more self-explanatory what this actually means. So now we have a Boolean that's determining whether or not we are currently replying. So what I can do is I can use that Boolean. I can say, hey, if we are replying, then render out this code in here. And this code is just going to be a div. We're going to give it some classes for spacing. So I'll say margin top is going to be 1, and the margin left is going to be 3, just to give it a little bit of spacing. I want to render out our comment form, just like this. And we can make sure it's self-closing. And this is going to have autofocus set to true. So we can say autofocus like this. We're going to give it an on submit. We're going to give it a loading, and we're going to give an error. But right now we don't know what those values are. So let's try to figure that out. Up at the top here, we need to get that information. So we first need to access use post, and we need to get that create comment function, which is called create local comment. We then need to make sure that we actually get our function for creating a comment on the server, and that's using useAsync. So we can say const, and this is going to be our create comment function is equal to useAsync func for create comment. Whoops, create comment. There we go. So we have all that imported. So now we have this create comment function, and remember it has a loading state, an error state, and a function, an execute state. So what we can do down here, wherever our comment is, we can say loading is going to be equal to create comment function dot loading. Our error is just going to be this dot error, and then our on submit, we're going to say on create comment. There we go. And actually, let's call that on comment reply. It's a little bit more explanatory as what's happening. So we can create a function up here on comment reply, which takes in our message, just like that. And the code inside of this is going to be almost the exact same thing as what we have in our post. I'll actually just copy that over because it's going to be, like I said, almost identical. So we'll paste that in. The only difference is we now have a parent ID. So we can say our parent ID is just going to be the ID of our current comment, just like that. The other thing that's different is this. We need to make sure we call the execute method on because we didn't destructure it up here. And inside of our .then, we need to do more than just creating our local comment. So we're going to say .then. Inside of here, we want to create a local comment. Make sure I get that spelled correctly. There we go. And also, we want to set our is replying to false because now we're no longer replying to the user at all. So that looks good. Now let's just make sure that we fix all of our errors. This should have post being here, and it says comment form is not defined. Well, let's just make sure we import that. There we go. That fixed all of our errors. So now when I click reply, you can see we get our form showing up. Type in a message. We'll just say reply, click post, and there we go. We'll say another reply, click post, and that shows up. And we can also toggle to close out of these. We can have multiple of them open at the same time. And the nice thing is when I click it, it automatically focuses, which is super handy. And when I refresh, all of those comments will be there because they all were stored in our server. So now let's do the exact same thing with editing. First, we need to go over to our service for comments. So service for comments, let's just copy this, paste it down, and this is going to be for updating a comment. To update a comment, we don't actually need a parent ID because you cannot change the parent ID, but we do need the ID of the comment we're updating. And this is going to be at the path that has our ID here as well. So we're going to be post/post ID, comments/comment ID. We're going to be doing a put method since that's what you use for updates. When we update this, we're only going to pass the message because you cannot change the parent ID. The only thing we can edit is the message. There we go. Now we have our update comment done. Now we can go onto our server and actually implement the logic for updating this. Let's just scroll down here. What I want to do is I want to create an app.put, and this is going to be at post/post ID/comments/comment ID. That's an async function with a request and a response, just like that. So the first thing I want to do is the same error check that I did in the create. I want to make sure we have an actual message. If we don't have a message, that's a bad thing. We should return an error. So next thing that I want to do is I want to check to make sure that you have permission to edit this. You should only be able to edit comments you created yourself. So we need to first get the user ID. We'll say user ID. And that's going to be equal to awaiting prisma.comment.find unique. And we want to get the comment where the ID is request.params.id. So I'm just getting the comment that currently exists. And then what I want to do is I want to select everything to do with the user ID. So we'll say user ID true, because that's all I care about is the user's ID. There we go. So we're getting the user ID and we're getting it for the current comment. Then I can say, hey, if our user ID is not equal to request.cookies.userID, so if the user ID that's saved inside of our cookies, which is like this secure location for our user information, if it's not the same as the user ID for the current comment, then we have an issue. So what we want to do is return another error, res.send app.http errors, and we're just going to send along bad request. I mean, you could send along like permission related errors. Like we could probably find like an authorization. We'll say unauthorized. There we go. Let's do that. And we could just say, you do not have permission to edit this message. There we go. So now if we send up the wrong user ID, so if we try to edit, for example, Sally's message, we're going to get an error if we're logged in as Kyle. So with all that error checking done, now we can finally actually make the changes. So to do this, simple, we're just going to await that commit DB. We're going to pass it in our prisma.comment.update function. And this takes a where clause, which in our case is just going to be the ID. So that's params.comment.id, just like that. And here, this should say comment ID as well. There we go. So where the comment ID, and then our data that we're updating is just the message, which is just our request.body.message. There we go. And for our select, the only thing that changes is our message. So the only thing I'm going to select is our message. And that right there is all we need to do to update it. The actual update's pretty easy. All the error checking, it's a little bit more involved. So that right there is everything for creating or updating our comment. Let's go back into our code, and we already have our service for this. So let's actually use that service inside of our comment form. So on our comment here, we know that we have an editing section, and this editing section is going to work almost the same as our replying section. So I'm going to copy this code. I'm just going to paste it into here. So on click, we're going to set is editing to the previous. And then here we're going to say is editing. And then for this label, again, exact same thing. If we are editing, then it's going to say cancel edit. Otherwise, it's going to say edit. And we already have there is replying. We can just change this to is editing. Set is editing. There we go. And by default, it is false. So now if I just click the edit button, you can see that it's currently toggling between the two states of edit and not edit, which is exactly what I want. But now I need to change it so that our message shows a form instead of showing the message. So here we can do another ternary. If we are editing, Then what I want to do is I want to render out the form. Otherwise, I want to render out what we were doing before, just rendering out the message. So for now, we'll just say edit and make sure I put that in a string. So now when we click the edit button, you can see it's changing this to edit and so on, which is what we want. And I'm getting message showing up twice. Let's make sure we remove that duplicate. So yeah, I'm changing the text to edit whenever I click the edit button. That's exactly what we want. But now instead of doing that, obviously we want to render out our comment form. So we're going to say comment form, self-close that. And we're obviously going to want to autofocus this. So we'll say autofocus. And our initial value is going to be equal to our message. So by default, when we click on this, it's going to be our message. So if we click on edit, you can see our default value inside of there is our message, which is what we want. If we didn't have this section right here, it would just be empty. As you can see, empty, not ideal. So that's why we have that initial value set to our message. Also, we're going to need our onSubmit. So our onSubmit, we're just going to call this on update or on comment update. And then we're going to have our loading. And this loading and error are going to work exactly the same. We're going to have an update comment function. We'll say loading. And our error is going to be update comment function dot error. That's going to be exactly the same. And to get that information, we're going to come up here. Same thing we did with useAsync. This is going to be update comment function. And this is going to be coming from our update comment that we got from our services up here. So we have our update comment. Again, it's just pretty much copying exactly what we did for our create comment. And now here, we're going to do an on comment update, and this is going to take in a new message as well. So we're going to call the update comment function. We're going to execute it, and we're going to pass in the information, which is our ID, our post ID, and our message. And then we're going to get a comment. We're going to set is editing to false. And for now, we're just going to console.log our comment, just so we can make sure everything's working before we move on to the next step. So I'm going to click edit. I'm going to change this to say to. Click post. You'll notice it doesn't change in the UI. We haven't implemented that yet, but hopefully in our comment, you can see it says a message with ASDF 2, which is what we want. And when we refresh, you can see it now has that 2 there. So now we just need to make sure we update this locally. So we can just use the update local comment function. And instead of passing in a comment, we'll need to do a little bit more because this comment really just contains the message. So we'll probably need to pass it in an ID and a message. And this message comes from our comment. So we can say comment.message is message. Let's look at it though. Let's go to our context and try to implement that. So we have our create local comment. We're going to need to have an update local comment as well. And here, update local comment. So for this update, it is going to take in an ID and a message. And what we want to do is just map over each of these. So we're going to return our previous comments.map each comment. And if our comment.id is equal to the ID that we passed in, well, what I want to do is I want to take everything to do with my comment except for my message and keep it the same. So I'm just replacing the message with a new message. Otherwise, I'm just returning our comment as is. So this is just updating the message of the comment with the ID we pass in. And we already are making sure we export that. So now if we go over to our comment page, we make sure here we just pass it the ID and the message like this. This should hopefully work. Update local comment, we need to import that up here from right there. There we go. So now if we click edit, change it to 3, click post, you can see it changed it there. And when I refresh, it still changed it everywhere else. That's exactly what we want. Next, we can focus on the delete portion of it as well. So just like with update and reply, delete is going to be very similar. First, we're going to create our service. So we're going to copy this down. We're going to say that we want to delete a comment. And for deleting a comment, we don't need a message. We just need the ID. So we don't have any data that we care about. We just want to send across a delete request. Then we can move over to our server. So let's go into our server. And we're going to do a very similar thing to what we did up here. I'm just going to copy our app.put, change this to app.delete. The route is exactly the same. We don't need an error check for message because we're not passing it up, but we do want to check to make sure the user ID is the same because obviously you do not have permission to delete this message if you are not the user that created it. And then we can come down here and we can do a delete. We don't need a data, but we do need a where, and the ID is the only thing we're going to select. So here we're going to do a delete where the ID is the exact same as our comment ID, and we're selecting the ID to return back to the user so we know which comment we deleted. That's all we need to do on the server. It's pretty straightforward. So now we can move over into our component or our comment. just back to here, and we can create our function, which is going to be onComment delete, and it's going to be taking in no message at all. It's just an onComment delete, and here we can call delete comment function just like that. So let's do that. Here we're going to use that delete comment. This is going to be called delete comment function, and we also want to have a delete local comment function, which we're going to need to create in just a second. So if we go over to our post context, we can create a function called delete local comment. We're going to take in the ID for the comment we want to delete. This is a pretty straightforward function. It's just going to set our comment based on our previous comments. And it's going to take our previous comments, filter each of the comments. So it's only going to get the comments where the ID is not equal to the ID we are removing. So it's going to get rid of everything except for it's going to get rid of only the thing we want to delete. And then let's just make sure we export that as well. So now inside of our comment, we now have access to that delete local comment. And inside of here, we have our onComment delete. What we want to do is we can just say delete local comment, just like that. And here we only care about passing along the post ID and the ID. So now let's go find our button that does the deleting. We can scroll down a little ways. We have this trash icon. So on click, we want to do the delete immediately on click. Also, we want to disable this button. So we're going to say that the disabled is going to be to delete local comment dot loading. So I'm sorry, delete comment function dot loading. There we go. So if we are currently in the process of deleting it, make sure we can't click the delete button again, because that could cause us to run into issues. Also up here, let's just make sure that we run this like this. We're going to be getting the ID here. And this ID is just going to be calling the delete local comment, and we're passing in that ID. Or we can just call this data, and we'll say data.er. You know what? Let's just call it comment. A little bit better naming, I think, if we do it that way. Okay, so let's see if this works. If we click delete right here, you can see that it removed that. And if we refresh, it's no longer here at all. It's completely removed. Same if we remove this one, it removed all those functions. And we can just delete all these ones that we don't care about. And you can see I'm trying to delete this one, which is the Sally one, but it's not letting me delete it because I am not Sally, I am Kyle. So it's throwing an error. We should probably render that error out to the user. So if we scroll down here quite a ways, underneath of all of this information, we can render out these different errors. So we can just do it right here. And what I can do is I can say, you know what, our delete comment function dot error. If we have an error, then what I want to do is I want to render out a div with the class name that is error message and margin top 1. And I'm just going to put that delete comment function dot error and close off that div. Immediately, when I say that, you'll notice that it now says you do not have permission to delete this message, which is exactly what we want. Same thing if I try to edit this and I click post, you're going to see it says you do not have permission to edit this message. So what we want to do is just get rid of this edit and delete button if we're not the active user. And luckily, we have this use user ID or use user hook that we can use to get the user ID. So I can say that our user ID equals use user. And this is actually just our current user. And then what we can do is way down here where we have our buttons, we have our edit and our delete button. I want to see if our user.id, which is the user of our current comment, is equal to our current user ID. Then we know that we can render out this information. So I'm just going to come in here and render out that information just like that. So we can just say, there we go. So now, let's see, looks like we got an error. Should be indented, and we need to make sure that we have fragments. There we go. Okay, use user is not defined. Obviously, let me make sure I import that. There we go. So now you can see all the ones that are Sally no longer have an edit and delete button, and only the ones that are Kyle, which is the current user I am, have that button. Now, if we go over to our server and we change the user we currently are logged in as to Sally, and I refresh the page, you'll see that now Sally has all the buttons and Kyle no longer has the buttons. Let's change that back and refresh, and we should be back to where we were before. Now we've handled everything that comes with creating, updating, reading, and deleting comments, but we don't have the ability to like yet. As you can see, all these have 2 likes, and all of them say that they are currently liked by me. Obviously, that's incorrect. So what we need to do is make sure we send back information from the server when we get the comments on the post and determine what the like count is and if you've actually liked this or not. So inside of our get for getting an individual post, we need to get a little bit additional information. So I'm going to select all of those original fields, but I'm also going to select some additional information. And this additional information is going to be a count. And this count we're going to select here are likes. So I can just say likes, true. So I'm getting a new property called underscore count, and it's going to be the count for how many likes this comment has. So each comment is going to tell me how many likes it has. Then what I want to do is I want to actually do a .then on the end of this, because I want to take that information and manipulate it in a way so I know how many likes are on the comment, and also if I currently, the signed in user, have liked this comment or not. So we're going to be getting a post, and this is going to be an asynchronous function. And inside of here, what I want to do is I want to get all of the likes. So I can say await Prisma.like.find many. I want to get all of the likes where the user ID is my current user ID, which is request.cookies.userid. Make sure that's inside of an object. And I also want to get it where the comment ID is in the list of comments for our post. So where the comment ID is post.comments.map comment.id. So what this is doing is giving me an array of all the IDs of all the comments for our post. And this query right here is giving me every single like that I have currently made on any of the comments on this post. So that's going to give me all my like related information. Then what I want to do is I want to manipulate this data. So I want to return essentially all of our original post information. By doing this, it's as if we didn't do anything else. But I want to add on a few extra fields. For example, in our comments, I want to take our post.comments, I want to map through them and make them look a little bit different. I want to add that like information. So here I want to get our count related information and then everything else related to our comment. So this is just taking this count and removing it from our comment, and then all the other fields are right here. And what I want to do is I want to return all those normal fields, but I want to add a new field for liked by me, which is a Boolean. And this Boolean is going to take our likes. This array of likes is every like I've ever made. And if the like in this list has the comment ID that matches the current comment ID, then that means I have liked this comment. That's all this array or this code right here does. And then we can get the like count, which is just comment dot, actually we can just do underscore count dot likes. There we go. So what this little bit of code right here is doing is it's just taking all of our normal post information, all of our normal comments information, but it's adding on 2 additional fields. We're determining, did I like this comment? And what is the like count of this comment? That is it, all that this does. So now what we can do is we can go down to this post as well, because we're going to change our post a little bit, because in our post, we want to also send down that like count information. So I can just say .then, this is going to return to me a comment, and I can return everything to do with my comment, but I want my like count to be 0 and liked by me to be false, because a brand new comment does not have any of this information. And actually, this .then should be moved to the location of creating comments, which is right here. That was my bad. So there we go. When we create a comment, send down information that says that the like count is 0 and that I have not liked it. That's all we need to do. So now we can go back into our code and we can actually set up the information for rendering out this like stuff. So in our comments, what we can do is we can get that information. That's being passed in here. So we have our like count and our, liked by me, just like that. So down where we're rendering our like here, we can say like count, and then this can determine if it's liked by me. So if it's liked by me, then we want to render that normal heart. Otherwise, we want to render the reg version of our heart, which is going to be the outline version. So if I have not liked it, it'll be an outline. And our label here, if it is liked by me, is going to say unlike, because we want to unlike this. Otherwise, it's going to say like if we have not liked it yet. So just by that little bit of code, you can see immediately all of these hearts have now been changed to, essentially empty hearts, but our like count is not quite showing up correctly. So let's make sure there's no errors. Let's just double check console. Doesn't look like there's any errors. If we go over to our server, let's see what we're returning. So what we can do here is we can just say console.log_count. Let's see what that data is being returned to us. So if we just refresh our page, we're getting a bunch of zeros. Oh, but it's saying likes 0. Okay, that seems fine. So let's say count.likes. So this should hopefully just return a bunch of zeros. It does. So that is our like count. Let me just make sure I maybe didn't spell anything incorrectly. So in our comment, this right here is saying like count. That is correct. And down here, we are rendering out our like count. Okay, so that should be rendering 0. Let's see. We just do a console.log like count. What does that give us? It should be a bunch of zeros. Console, it is a bunch of zeros. Okay, so that makes me think our icon button has some problems. Our children are maybe not rendering properly. So let's just do console.log children. This again should be a bunch of zeros. And we just refresh the page. It is a bunch of undefineds and a bunch of zeros. That is a little bit, oh, that makes sense because half our buttons are undefined, half of them are zero. Oh, and there we go, our zeros are showing up. So I guess it must have just been a problem with the refreshing of the page. We now have the zeros showing up. That is good. And if our like count changes or we like it, this will change these numbers. So now we can actually implement the liking of this information. So the very first step for us is going to be using our service to create a function to do this, just like we've done with everything else. This function is going to be called toggle comment like, and it's going to take in an ID and a post ID, so we can associate this with a particular comment. And we're going to return that make request function. We're going to pass it in /posts. We want to go to post ID, which is going to be /comment. We want to get the ID for our comment, and then we want to call the toggle like route on this. And this right here is going to have a method, which is a post request. And that's it. We don't need to pass any fancy data because all the data is in the URL. Now what we can do is we can go over to our server and actually create this right on our server. So let's just minimize all these so we don't have them in our way. There we go. It's a little bit cleaner. We can just say app.post, and this URL is going to be pretty long. So I'm going to copy this URL because it's almost the same. It's just a little bit longer because it now has toggle like on the end, async, and we want to get our request and our response. Just like that. Now this is going to be a little bit different than the rest of these functions because first we need to figure out if we have a like. If we do, remove it. Otherwise, if we don't, add it. So I'm going to get the data. And this data is just going to be our comment ID, which is, request.params.comment ID, and then our user ID, which is request.cookies.user ID. So we have our data information. And I also want to get the currently existing like. So we can just say await prisma.like.findUnique, and I want to find the unique one where our user ID comment ID is equal to our data. We're just saying, hey, get me the like that has this comment ID and this user ID. And the reason that it's conjoined like this is because when we created this in Prisma, we gave it a joint ID. The ID is both the user ID and the comment ID. That's why this code looks like this. So now if our like is equal to null, then we do something. Otherwise, if it's not, we do something else. So if we do not have a like yet, we want to create one. So we can await that commit to DB, where we say prisma.like.create, and we pass it in our data. And then what we can do is we can return the information that we care about. And the only information we care about is just, we can say add like true. So this is just so that on the client, we know, okay, we created a brand new like, increment the number by 1. Otherwise, in this case, our add like is going to be false because we're going to be doing a delete. So our delete here is going to be saying where our user ID comment is equal to that data. And if we just save this, we now are essentially creating a like if one doesn't exist, or we're removing it if it does. So we're toggling between like or dislike. That's essentially all that this is doing. Now we can go back into our post context. So let's find our context for our post context, because now we need to add another function for toggling a like. So function toggle local comment like. It's going to take an ID, and it's going to take a variable for if we added the like or not. So I want to call that set comments. I want to get the previous comments. And inside of here, we actually need to do quite a bit of work. So we're going to take our previous contents or comments. We want to map over each individual comment because we want to find the comment we're associated with. So if the ID is equal to our comment.id, now we are on the correct comment. What we can do here is a simple else, because if we're not on the correct comment, we'll just return. We don't want to change the comment. But if we are on the correct comment, we now need to see, are we adding a like? If we're adding a like, well, then we just need to increment that liked by count and say that we have liked this. So what we can do is we can return everything to do with our comment, but our like count is going to be our comment.like count plus 1. Whoops. And liked by me is going to be set to true. And if we're not adding this like, so we can put an else in here, then this is going to be subtracting 1 from the like count, and liked by me is going to be set to false. So now we can just add this into the bottom of our context right here. So we have access to this, and inside of our comments component, we can actually use this. So we can essentially do the same thing we've done for everything else. We can import that function right here. We can create a new handler for our useAsync. That is going to be for toggling our comment like, and I didn't even spell toggle comment like correctly, so let me fix that. There we go. And let me make sure I import that properly. There we go. Perfect. Looks like we're getting an error. That's fine. This should say toggle comment like function. There we go. Then we can scroll down here. We can create a function called on toggle comment like. We can return the function that we just created. We want to execute that function. And we're going to pass it our ID and our post ID, which is post.id. We can then call .then. And this is going to be our add like that's being returned to us. We can just call toggle comment like the local version, pass it in our ID and our add like. There we go. Make sure that looks correct. I got an error with my formatting. This should have a parenthesis right there. There we go. So now we can take this function, move all the way down here for our like button. We can add an on click to call that on toggle comment like, and disabled on this is just going to be equal to toggle comment like function dot loading, because when we're loading this, we don't want this button to be enabled. So now we can scroll down, click the like button, and you can see it's incrementing that like and it's toggling it for us. There is one issue though, in that the heart is not filling in when we're liking it, even though it should be filled in. So this liked by me property is probably not being set properly. So let's see what we could do about that. First of all, if we look inside of our post context, that would be the first place to look, because this is where we're setting our liked by me. And it should be setting that to true when we're adding our like. So that seems correct, and it is incrementing our like count, so that should be correct. But it should say liked by me and not like by me. That should hopefully fix the issue. As you can see, now these hearts are filled in, and they're actually changing when I click this like button. And that is how you build this full comment system. If you want to build a simpler full stack project, I have a project on how to build a file upload and sharing process with user authentication. It's going to be linked over here, as well as some of the other videos I mentioned in this video. I'm going to link them over here as well. With that said, thank you very much for watching and have a good day.